Madeleine Albright served as Secretary of State from 1997 2001. She was the first woman to serve in that capacity. Her biography is incredibly long. She's a professor still at Georgetown University. She was just talking about classes that she's learning to do on Zoom right now. She's the author of 7 best-selling books. In addition to working at the State Department as secretary, she also was the UN ambassador to the United States ambassador to the United Nations for 4 years. She worked for, not to date her, but President Carter's National Security Council. She worked for Ed Muskie of Maine. She has degrees from Wellesley College and a master's and PhD from Columbia University. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the nation's highest honor, from Barack Obama, in 2012. And just 2 weeks ago, I see that you were named to the Governing Magazine Government Hall of Fame, which is not as big an honor, but you were inducted along with Frederick Douglass, which is rather impressive. And one thing that's not on her bio that she doesn't put down, she's also a TV actress. She's been on the Gilmore Girls and Parks and Recreation.
And Madam Secretary.
And Madam Secretary, okay. And we just asked students, and Yenna, you want to say, where do students think that Madeleine Albright was born?
Let's see. Czechoslovakia.
All right, that is correct.
Very good, great.
Born in Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic, and came over as an 11-year-old as a refugee, coming through Ellis Island, right? Like a lot of immigrants. So as usual, I'm going to start with a few questions, and I know we have a lot of people who'd love to ask the secretary questions. So type your questions into the Q&A, put your name down, and we will unmute you. And if you're scared to ask a question, don't be. But if you're still scared to ask a question, just put it down anonymously and I'll ask it for you. But let me start out by asking what would be lots of questions I have. But let me start with COVID, because it's on everybody's mind. I heard you say in an interview sometime in the last 6 months that had you been Secretary of State when this began, it would have been handled very differently, suggesting that this could have been handled much, much better from an international standpoint. What could you have done as Secretary of State to help with this pandemic?
Well, I do think that we have dealt with pandemics before in terms of trying to figure out how to, first of all, understand that for the most part, pandemics know no borders, and that in many ways it is an international problem that has to be handled. And so I think that it is an appropriate thing to be handled by a combination of what we call the whole of government approach to it, because it isn't just a foreign problem, it is also how it is handled domestically. And maybe we'll talk about decision making generally, but there are some issues which do have to be handled by more than one department. I do think that what one has to do from a foreign policy standpoint is to understand what is going on in the other countries and develop some kind of a cooperation through various parts of their health system and their foreign policy so that they can handle it from their stage. And then, first of all, you do have to understand what it is about and the scientific aspect. The other part that I think is important, and clearly was when we were beginning to handle HIV/AIDS and then basically other pandemics, is that you need to get the private sector involved in it, because the government can't produce the medicines or the drugs that need to be used for it. So, but the main thing is you have to recognize it as while it has its national basis, it is an international problem and therefore requires the cooperation of other countries in it.
So our relationship with China, which has been strained to say the least, is that something which, having been in these positions, do you think that a more cooperative international team at the White House would have been able to get better answers quicker from China?
Well, I do think so, but I also think that I have not fully understood what some of the things are that the World Health Organization is accused of, whether there really was not enough contact, first of all, in terms of the United States government with the World Health Organization to really get some of the facts, and then trying to figure out with the Chinese what was going on. And mostly, my sense is from other issues, you do have to understand the facts of a situation. You can't just start making them up. And you need to understand that some issues, no matter how tough you are or how powerful your country is, cannot be handled alone. And this clearly was one of them that could not. And by just being accusatory versus China, in many ways, it undercut possibilities to find out cooperation. But I have to say, I personally am getting more and more confused about what did President Trump know and when did he know it? Because the fact is that the books that have come out really would indicate that he knew about this very early and then for whatever reason didn't take action on it, even though the infrastructure was there to do something about it, and the kinds of things that I've been talking about that would need to be done could have been done, I think, if there'd been a different approach.
So staying on the president for a moment, I got an email, believe it or not, from you this morning, which scared me because I thought, oh no, something's come up, because it even said, hey, Mark, or something like that. But no, this was not a personal email. This was, you sent out an email. It was, I'm on so many lists. You were, I think, raising money, or at least raising the alarm about another 4 years of President Trump. And so talk to us for a moment. I mean, there is a possibility that President Trump is reelected a week from yesterday. If that were the case, talk to us for a moment about what you see the dangers in foreign policy.
Well, first of all, I do think that the important part is to recognize that there are issues in the world that require us to cooperate with other countries, that can't be handled by one country alone, no matter how strong we are. And the relationship between domestic and foreign policy has to be considered. I mean, every president's job is to protect the people, the territory, and the way of life. And our territory, despite the fact that we have lived with two oceans on either side of us, they have been breached, and we do have two friendly neighbors. There are issues that really come up. And so I think that what has happened is that we have lost the relationships that one needs, but most of all, we have had a president who has created animosity with other countries and has, in fact, not perpetuated any ways that other countries trust us, trust our word. Because so many of the things that happen in national security policy are based on policy that has been laid out, that is understood by the people within a government to carry it out, and also depends an awful lot on the relationship that our country has with other countries. And if all you do is berate them or think that you're involved in zero-sum game deals, then it undercuts that sense. And then I have to tell you, my sense from listening and talking to people, we've been AWOL on an awful lot of things, have not participated. And so I think it's going to take a lot of rebuilding of relationships and a rebuilding of trust for the United States.
So how much of how big an alarm would you sound on that? I read somewhere you said you're an optimist, but you worry a lot. So with that view, I mean, there are some people out there who are just worried and they're panicked about, I mean, I've read a lot of very prominent people say that another 4 years of this presidency will make American foreign policy something that we will never recover from.
Well, I would agree. Never is a long time, but I would definitely agree that another 4 years would be as damaging / disastrous as anything that could happen, because there are issues that have to be handled. The virus has to be handled, but climate change has to be handled. Nuclear proliferation has to be handled. Generally, arms control are issues that need to be handled. Our economic situation needs to be handled. Everything needs to be handled, and it has to be handled in some kind of a coherent way, and also by experts. The president, no matter who he or she is, does need an organizational system that produces issues for decision and then is able to carry them out.
So one of the other questions then we asked students, and Yana, if you could just tell us what they said, was what they think 25 years from now the biggest issue, the biggest threat to the United States is, and we gave them limited choices. But Yana, what did they say?
Sure. So 42% of our attendees stated global warming.
And what came in second? I'm just curious.
Second, I want to say fascism, and then 18% towards China and Russia.
Okay, so what is your assessment about me? Because the people you're talking to here are going to be the leaders in 25 years, certainly in 30, 40 years. They're going to be the next secretaries of state and all. What international crises do you think they're going to have to deal with the most?
Well, I have to say I'm very glad to hear that they see climate change as the #1 crisis, because I think that shows their comprehension of what is happening now that will mark or mar the time that they will be in office. Because it's interesting, because people my age, people worried about that we would be killed by missiles. And that seemed very real all of a sudden, very quickly. I think part of the problem is that the generations that are making decisions now, some of them understand global warming, but don't see it as an immediate threat. I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that it's closer than a lot of people thought about. And it is something that can be dealt with international cooperation. So I'm very glad to hear that this generation, that the student generation, is one that sees that as a major threat. I do think the other part, and I'm happy to talk about this more, is that the generation of students, and I see this in my students, are obviously more acclimated to various technology that is going to take place, and that provides tools for them to operate with, that a lot of older people, me included, have some problems adjusting to. So, but I think that I do see climate change as very a key one. What is interesting, if one goes back now to the more substantive regional ones, the China part in this fits in, because we can't deal with climate change without relationships with China. They are now the second largest economy. We know that they do a lot of polluting, and that they are, from what I've read, interested in doing something about climate change. They also have been very smart about filling the void that we have left by not being proactive on a variety of national security issues, including climate change, because there are some people that are in charge at the moment who think the earth is flat. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of work to do in that.
So let me switch gears for a moment. When you first started working on Capitol Hill for Senator Muskie, I'm not sure the exact number, but there's probably 10 to 12 women in Congress at that point. And things have changed dramatically, although women are still only, a fifth of the Congress. So you were the groundbreaker as the first American Secretary of State. I'm curious whether or not, and you write in your book eloquently about the way that you were treated. Sometimes people saw the power in your position. Other times they treated you as not as seriously. I'm wondering, did you face more difficulty in your diplomatic career domestically or abroad because you were a woman?
Well, let me explain, and I'm glad you asked that. What happened was, when my name came, just to talk a little bit about what happens in this kind of time, it was very clear. I was ambassador to the UN. It was clear that Secretary Christopher wasn't going to stay for a second term. So all of a sudden, there was what I call the period of great mentioning. Who were the people that were potential secretaries of state? And because I did have a great job at the UN and had been a cabinet member and had been on TV a lot, my name was out there. And so all of a sudden, somebody said a woman couldn't be Secretary of State because Arab leaders wouldn't deal with a woman. And so the Arab ambassadors at the UN got together and they said, we've had no problems dealing with Ambassador Albright. We wouldn't have any problems dealing with Secretary Albright. So that went away. Then somebody at the White House, and I never want to know who, said, yeah, Madeleine's on the list, but she's second tier. And so I really never thought that I would become Secretary of State. I think that to answer your question, I had less problems with foreign leaders than with Americans. And partially because many of them knew that if they were going to deal with the United States, they would have to deal with whoever was Secretary of State. And one of my first foreign trips actually was to Saudi Arabia, to the international, the group of Muslim countries in the Middle East, and it certainly. I did arrive in a large plane that said United States of America, and this was with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and the meeting was over, and I said to them, perhaps you've noticed that I'm dressed differently from my predecessors, and you have been very kind, and I look forward to other meetings, and next time we'll talk about women's rights. And we actually did. I had more problems with the men in our own government, partially, and I attribute it to this, they had known me too long. I had lived in Washington a long time. I had been a carpool mother. I had them over for dinner where I, passed around the dishes or whatever. I had been a staffer, made a lot of coffee. And I know that many of them wanted to be Secretary of State. And so they thought, well, how did she get to be Secretary of State when I should be Secretary of State? The thing I know now, because I was Secretary of State and one of the things that used to happen, President Clinton and First Lady Hillary Clinton and I used to travel occasionally, and we were somewhere and I would introduce her and she would introduce him. And we were on one of these trips, and President Clinton actually said that during this period of the Great Mentioning, that Hillary would come to him and say, why wouldn't you get Madeleine? She is most in tune with your views, expresses them better than anybody else, and besides, it would make your mother happy. So that's how it happened.
So, all right, so what advice, it's tough for our interns because a lot of them don't get treated, they're at the bottom of the pecking order in a sense. And, but what would you say? Women do still find themselves outnumbered by men when it comes to those who do foreign policy here in this country. And I'm wondering what advice then you'd give to young women who want to follow in your footsteps.
Well, I think the following thing, and I do think this is important to know, you really do have to work hard. There's no question about this. I think that there's no room for women, mediocre women. Women have to work harder. There's no question about that. I think also that you can't expect immediate way of moving up the ladder. It takes a while. You do have to do kind of serve in apprenticeship roles of kind of learning what the job is and not saying kind of, I don't do that kind of work. I think that, as I said, I made a lot of coffee, I Xeroxed and I think that, and I was willing to do things that some other people might not have wanted to in terms of the kinds of responsibilities or lack of that I was given. So I really do think that one has to be prepared to work hard. The other part, and this has been something that I've talked about quite often, that it is very hard to be the only woman in the room. And I think every woman my age and some younger have had this experience, which is you're in a meeting and you think to yourself, well, I won't say anything because people will think it's stupid. And then some man says exactly what you wanted to say, and everybody thinks it's brilliant. And you think, why didn't I speak up? And why didn't I interrupt? Because one of the issues often is that when women raise their hands in a meeting, you're not called on until whatever you had to say is no longer germane. So my mantra, and I've talked to my students about this, is women have to learn to interrupt. And it means that you listen in a different way. I invented this term, active listening, that you know that you're going to say something, you have to get your facts straight, and you have to speak with a firm voice. Now, when I started teaching at Georgetown, which is co-ed school, and I said everybody had to interrupt. So my classes were a bit of a zoo, but I do think that it's important to know that you can't wait to be called on, and that So there's a combination of a certain amount of humility and a certain amount of just a sense that you can do something. So it's a combination of things you have to do. And you always, and this I think is really important, is if you have been asked to do something, do it. You have to be dependable. You have to finish what you were asked to do. It is very important that whoever is the boss can say, well, you know, Madeleine will finish it. She will do it. And I advise people to do that.
All right, so I'm going to ask one more question. So please, folks, if you got questions, put them in the Q&A. We've got a bunch of questions coming in, which is excellent. So, I mean, it's clear for people of my generation that because women are involved now, there's a bigger pool of talent out there. I mean, that's obvious. There are talented people of both genders. I'm wondering if you can talk for a moment about, and the answer, if women were in charge, how we might see substantive differences. I mean, are women diplomats different than male diplomats?
I do think men and women think differently. And I do think that women are able to put themselves into other people's shoes better. These are generalizations, by the way, and a capability of finding common ground. I do think that's there. What we have right now is a very interesting example of countries that are run by women that have been able to deal with the COVID virus. New Zealand, Taiwan, Germany, Finland, Norway, Iceland. And that it really, I think partially because they've been able to get buy-in by other parts of the government. There's not an ego thing involved in it. It is a way of problem solving. So I think that there are things that women can do. I do think women and men, and again, this is a generalization, think differently. Women, because we are asked to multitask an awful lot, have what I say peripheral vision. You can kind of see where the problems are coming from. There's not a lot of ego involved in making the decision, and you keep looking for solutions. I think men have a capability of thinking more deeply about one subject. And I do think that it's important for there to be men and women working together to solve problems. And by the way, I'm sometimes asked whether the world would be better if it were totally run by women. And I say, if you think that, you've forgotten high school. So I do think it's important to work together.
Okay, let's start with some questions. These range from narrow to broad. Talia. And we'll take just a second to get them up. But Talia, when you're unmiked, yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much, Secretary. It was amazing hearing you speak, and it was super inspiring to hear your story. I guess my question is a little more specific. As someone who's interning at the State Department, I am curious to ask you how I can get more out of my internship experience, specifically in a virtual manner.
Well, let me, I think that the most important thing is to be curious about what you're doing and be interested in what you're doing. And then to the extent that the people around you want to talk about what they're doing, I think that is a very good way to get more knowledge and experience. I think also it is worth thinking about whether, and I don't know, where are you interning? What are you doing?
I'm at the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs.
Well,
so
there's an incredible amount of stuff going on, and I think you could also do as much research as possible on your own in terms of the issues so that you become very knowledgeable about the things that are happening. But curiosity is, I think, one of the important parts in terms of getting more out of it. And then, and again, at the moment, I'm not sure how things are working at the State Department, but I think having a mentor makes a big difference, and somebody that you can ask questions of, and somebody that you feel comfortable with, and he or she would feel comfortable in answering the questions with you. But internships are a great opportunity to learn and to spread your wings on various things. But I do think, to go back to something I said, if you're asked to do something, even if you think it's menial, do it with a smile.
Thank you so
Okay,
much.
let's go to Lachlan. Lachlan Shan.
Hi, you can all hear me, right?
We can hear you.
Okay. Hello, Secretary. It's a pleasure to meet you. So I was going to ask. So from your, I'm Korean. My family's from South Korea. So your experience working, being Secretary of State. I was wondering, what do you think of the North Korean threat today? How has it changed from when you were Secretary of State to now? And what do you think our response should be towards North Korean aggression?
Well, I don't know how much you know about this, but it is practically exactly 20 years that I was in North Korea.
Wow.
And what had happened was that we had been dealing with the North Korean issue for some time, a number of different aspects in terms of their wanting to develop weapons and missiles long range, and developing and having nuclear reactors, and a variety of things that had been there for some time. In the summer of 2000, what happened was Vice Marshal Cho, the #2 guy, came to the United States. We were in the
Wow.
Oval Office, and he gave President Clinton a folder which had an invitation for President Clinton to come to North Korea. And President Clinton wisely said, well, at some point I might go, but this would have to be prepared. So I'm going to ask the Secretary of State to go. So I went and I met with Kim Jong-il. Now, one of the problems about not having diplomatic representation, it was very hard to figure out what was going on. And I won't tell the whole story, but it really was a complicated time. And we didn't have the right information about Kim Jong-il. We were told he was crazy. He wasn't crazy. We were able to have very serious technical discussions about missile limits. And while I hold no brief for the North Koreans, with what happened in the elections of 2000, when the Bush people came in, what happened was I had briefed Colin Powell on what had already begun some talks about the missile limits. And Colin Powell wanted to continue. He was going to be the new Secretary of State. There was a headline in the Washington Post saying Powell to continue Clinton policies on North Korea. He was hauled into the Oval Office and told no way. So we cut off the talks. I think that what is happening is dangerous. There's no question about it. And I think we probably know a little bit more about Kim Jong-un, but I am concerned about some of the things that are happening. They have, from what I read in the papers, they have more capability and fissile material, and that we haven't gotten very far. They have made a variety of threats. And I think that President Trump declaring that they love each other doesn't seem to be helping in anything. So it is dangerous. I think, I don't know, have you ever been to the demilitarized zone?
Personally, no, but I've heard a lot of stories.
It is the weirdest place I've ever been to. And I think that most people don't recognize the fact of how close the demilitarized zone is to Seoul, and that the North Koreans do have a 1 million man army, and there is concern. And I think it is important for us to try to have talks with them with some preconditions, but I really do think that we need the help of the Chinese in this. And we need to recognize it as a dangerous, a serious problem that has to be dealt with in a proactive way.
I see. Thank you, Secretary.
So we have an anonymous question from someone who wants to know about the pin you're wearing and understands from your writings and talks that the pins all have special meaning, and wants to see if you can explain the meanings and maybe the meaning of the one you're wearing right now.
So let me tell you how this started. I became ambassador to the United Nations after the Gulf War. And in 1993, what had happened was the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions. And I was what's known as an instructed ambassador, and my instructions were to make sure the sanctions stayed on. So I said perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein constantly, which he deserved because he'd invaded Kuwait. And all of a sudden, a poem appeared in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them an unparalleled serpent. And I happened to have had a snake pin. So I decided to wear the snake pin when I talked about Iraq. And so what happened was that soon the press picked it up and was asking me about it. And I said, because he compared me to an unparalleled serpent, and I was living in New York, and I went out and I shopped for a lot of costume jewelry to depict what I thought was going to happen on any given day in the UN. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons, and on bad days, a lot of carnivorous animals and spiders and things. And the other ambassadors kind of picked it up and they said, what are we going to do today? And I said, read my pins. So I began to use pins to signal things. And for instance, one of the things, when I became Secretary of State, the Russians were bugging the State Department. They had a guy listening to us, and he was sitting outside. We found him. We did what diplomats do, which is to demarche Moscow and say you couldn't be doing this. But the next time I met with the Russian foreign minister, I wore this huge bug, and he knew exactly what I was thinking about and what I was signaling. So today I'm wearing an owl for wisdom, because I thought that our having this discussion would help me to learn a lot of things about you, and hopefully you some things about me and national security policy.
Excellent. Okay, Howard Tran.
Hi. Hi, thank you, Secretary, for giving us this talk. I just wanted to ask do you think that President Trump's decision to close travel to China at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic was an effective foreign policy?
Well, I think that the question was, what would have been an effective policy? And I think that if that had been more a part of something larger in terms of trying to figure out what was happening, and as I understand it, he was told by scientists about the danger of the virus and making sure that it didn't spread. So I think saying that, I mean, what has happened now is there's no travel, and I think just generally people are not traveling because we are the spreaders of things. But that is not the only part, and it was done in such a way, and some of the haranguing the Chinese and deliberately calling it the Chinese plague and various aspects makes it very difficult, and had made it difficult for some way to deal with this, where they could take responsibility for what they had done and be helpful in terms of how we limit the way that it spread. But I think of the various steps that Trump took, the steps he didn't take were the ones that were the worst in terms of not recognizing what could have been done generally if he had seen this, if he'd interpreted the science he was learning and the danger in a way of having a plan for the or using a policy in the United States, and not just kind of saying that it would go away.
Okay, our next question comes from Danielle Miller, who can't get her audio to work, so I'm reading the question instead, which is fine. How do we rebuild Americans' trust in the incredible work of nonpartisan civil servants, from intelligence and national security experts to the State Department diplomats, who President Trump has taken great lengths to politicize and debase, for example, with conspiracies about the deep state?
Well, I think this is one of the major issues that we have to do. The State Department, for instance, is denuded of really smart people who either were asked to leave or left themselves because of the way they were treated. They were combinations of Foreign Service officers and civil servants. I think that I was appalled very early on when there were statements made about the people that work in the US government as being disloyal and undermining the positions that they had or what they were trying to do, and thereby undermining our own strength. And so I'm hoping that a lot of people will be rehired that a lot of people will be willing to go back, and that we also will supplement a lot of those people by a lot of new young people who are willing to begin their careers by going into the government. I really do believe, of the various things that I have done, is to be a public servant is a very great honor. And nobody works in order to undermine their government, unless, of course, they are spies or sent by an ill-meaning force. But I do think the following things is that we need to recognize the value of people that serve the government. And I just tell you a personal story. I love being Secretary of State. I could have done it forever. And I was so jealous of the people who got to stay and to be able to continue working on national security policy for the country that you were born in or have been welcomed as a refugee is a great honor. And then I thought about that it's actually pretty hard for people to work for different administrations, and that one had to understand and have the trust of the people, and that is the normal way of behaving. There are people that are used to going to being parts of different administrations who are loyal Americans and are doing their job. And I think that we need to get back to times like that where we understand people's capabilities and that they have sworn that many of them have taken the oath to honor the Constitution, and many of them are really proud to be public servants, and I hope that many of them are able to go back.
So let's go to Callum. You mentioned young people. Callum sounds like he might be too young from what he wrote to be a UCDC student now, but hopefully he will be in the future. Callum, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Callum. What do you think are the good qualities of a political leader in the current COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I think the good qualities of a leader is to study the things that are going on and to understand you can't fake it, that there are an awful lot of issues that need to be understood in depth, and that a leader is somebody that has access to information that others are willing to provide, to discuss, and to help in the learning process. A leader also has to listen. I think that is a very important part of leadership, is to listen to the people that you're working with, but also to people that disagree with you, to understand what their issues are. I also do think that a leader has to be somebody that can have empathy towards those that are suffering, that need to have help. And so there needs to be, the character of a leader is very important. Somebody who really does understand the things that need to be done. And so I think that there are many parts to it, but I think that having some humility, listening, and studying. It does take a lot of study, I can assure you of that. And so I think that's an important part.
Let's, and sorry for the people unmuting because I'm jumping around a bit. Let's go to Victor. Victor Tiglia or Tiglo.
Hello, Madam Secretary. I am so inspired by your story. I love you. I adore you. I came to this country as a child as well. I understand that when you were in the Clinton administration, you were not in the presidential line of succession. Do you think it's time to allow naturalized citizens to be eligible to run for president?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that. It was interesting because I was not only not in the line of succession, but had something happened, nobody cared what would have happened to me because there were kind of briefings and I was not a part of them. But let me say this, I do think that the thing that makes a difference in terms of people is whether I think if one has lived a long time in the United States and has had an American education, that I think it would be all right for people like that to be in the line of succession. But it's a very touchy issue. I have never testified on it because it seems self-serving. But I do think that there are people with very great principles that have been born or live in other countries. But I do think that the experience of living as an American is a very important part of this. And so then, of course, the question is, how long would you have had to have lived in the United States in order to really do it? And we know that the reason this is in the Constitution the way it is because of Alexander Hamilton. So I think that there were political reasons why somebody that was not born on the territory of the United States would not be considered. But I do think the thing that I think is also very important is for there to be respect for people that are naturalized citizens and people who come here by choice. And I love telling this story. One of my favorite things to do when I was Secretary of State was to give naturalization certificates. And so the first time I did it was July 4th, 2000 at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home. I figured since I had his job, I could do that. And so I'm giving this man his certificate and he walks away and I hear him saying, "Can you believe it? I'm a refugee and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State." So I go and find him and I say, "Can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State?" And it was my highest honor to be able to represent the United States.
Thank you so much for that.
Let's go to Micah Moss.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
You can.
Hi, Madam Secretary. It is such an honor. So my question to you is, what was the most difficult moment for you while serving as Secretary of State?
Well, one of the hardest things was the following, and I don't want to tell the whole story because it would take so long, but one of the things that I really cared about was what was going on in the Balkans. That was one of our issues that we had to deal with. And I had, and I have such a crazy life that my father at one stage was the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia. So I understand the Balkans and I understand the languages, and those were the issues that we had to deal with at the time. And so I believed that we needed to do something about Kosovo, where people were being ethnically cleansed, killed for who they were, not anything they had done. And that I thought that we needed to do something, that we had the capability of stopping that. And so it makes a very good case study in terms of the Secretary of State can say pretty much anything, but doesn't have airplanes. So it requires cooperation with the Defense Department. So persuading the Defense Department to do something about it. And we managed that, and President Clinton wanted to do it. And so the war started, and it was an air war, and all of a sudden the weather was bad, and the Serbs put out decoys of various kinds, and everything was going wrong. And all of a sudden I came into my office a few days later, and my executive assistant said to me, "Sit down." And I said, "What's the matter with you?" He said, "Just sit down." And I said, "What?" And he said, "We have just bombed the Chinese embassy by mistake." And it made for a terrible mess with the Chinese and problems, and it was a mistake. And then people were saying that the war was a mistake, and it was called Madeleines War. When we won, it was called something else. But the bottom line is that I felt, oh my God, how did I, why am I responsible for this? How did this happen? But it turned out, well, there's a whole generation of young women now in Kosovo whose first name is Madeleine. And I went and I visited last year with President Clinton because it was the 20th anniversary of the end of that war. And I've never seen so many signs, "Thank you, USA," or so many American flags. So while there really felt like a huge mistake, it turned out, I think, with the right outcome in so many ways, though it's not finished and there are a lot of things to do.
Okay, let's go to Daniel. Daniel Maciel. Sorry if I'm butchering your name, Dan.
I don't see him on the list of participants currently.
Okay, that's fine. We're gonna jump over. Actually, while we'll have Michelle up in a moment, but while we get Michelle up, let me ask, because several different people now, and they seem to think it's an embarrassing question, so they've kept it anonymous. But it's an easy question, maybe. They want to know how realistic Madam Secretary, the TV show, is.
Well, no, so I have to tell you all this. You were talking about my TV background, and it really was through Gilmore Girls and Parks and Recreation. And so what happened was all of a sudden I get a call from the producers of the show, and they wanted me to meet with Taya Leone, who was going to play the Secretary of State. And we're having this conversation about what it was like to be Secretary of State. And I thought, why am I doing this? And then I actually do watch television, and I sometimes have rationalized that I learn from certain programs, certain issues. For instance, there was a show called Army Wives on at a certain time that explained a lot about the hard things that happen to spouses, and that TV in many ways is a good way of providing information. So I thought this is great because the American public is going to, in fact, be able to understand certain problems that are out there that the United States has to deal with. So in terms of the issues and problems that are raised, it's very realistic, I have to say. I do have to tell you the following thing, though. What happened was, I've been on it a couple of times, but the last time was when it was towards the beginning of their season and their last season. And so they invited Secretary Clinton and General Powell, and we were all on it, and something horrible had happened at the White House, and the Secretary of State called us to meet. And so everything was scripted, but I got an unscripted line in. As we're about to sit down, I say, isn't it great when the current Secretary of State calls her predecessors to consult? We used to do that all the time, and they left that in. So I do think it's pretty realistic.
Okay, Michelle. That's, yeah, Michelle Abundis. There you are.
Hi, sorry about that. My question, Madam Secretary, you discussed the power vacuum that has been created as the U.S. has rescinded from international arena. How much difficulty do you foresee for the U.S. to resume an active role abroad if it is that presidencies change in the next 4 years?
Well, let me just say, if what happens is that Vice President Biden becomes President Biden, there couldn't be a better person in terms of his understanding of the various issues in the countries, and also his personal relationships with a lot of the leaders. Relationships do make a difference. But what is going to happen is to restore America's credibility and trust in our decisions. And that's going to take a little bit of time. It's not going to be automatic. It also will require, as I mentioned, the State Department has been kind of denuded. It's going to do diplomacy, you actually need diplomats. So there are people that are going to have to be asked to return. There need to be new recruits so that people are out there doing diplomacy. It's going to take some humility, frankly, and then an assessment of where we can make a difference. And it's going to take time in terms of getting support of Congress, because the foreign affairs budgets have to be funded. The new people coming in are going to have to be confirmed. And so I don't think things can change overnight, but I do think that if Vice President Biden's already talked about the idea of having a democracy summit, of really talking to other countries of what he wants to do on climate change and on arms control and dealing with the virus and developing, various ways of looking at the issues. There was a very interesting story today about the fact that he wanted to spend more time in dealing with Latin America. And so there is going to be a renewed interest in knowing what is happening in other countries and doing what diplomacy is supposed to do, is to put yourself into the other guy's shoes and not go around threatening and saying that we're either being threatening or acting like a victim. So there's going to be a lot of work to do. But I think that if the Biden administration comes together, or election and then comes together, there will be a lot of work to do, that there will be very qualified people to undertake it.
We're going to try to get in a few last questions. Let's go to Leanna and maybe Tara after that.
Hi, Madam Secretary, Professor, thank you for your time today. I was wondering, given the current situations with China, North Korea, Russia, what's the likelihood of the US engaging in another war in the Pacific?
I hope very much that there will not be another war in the Pacific, but it is a dangerous area. There's no question. What concerns me at the moment is more that there might be some kind of accident because of the things that the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea and, sailing around, that there might be some accident with a fishing vessel, and then there wouldn't be enough communication in order to de-escalate what was going on. I do think that we have to be concerned about a number of things that have happened that don't necessarily lead to war, but need to be expressed in terms of what's happening to the Uyghurs in China, or what happened in Hong Kong, threats against Taiwan. And so I think that the relationship with China has got to be one that is kind of multidimensional. We have to find areas where we can cooperate, and I've already mentioned climate change. We need to also find places where we will compete. There's no question we're competing in terms of technology and cyber issues. And then we need to recognize there will be some where we really are adversaries. And so it's going to take interest, knowledge, and an understanding of statecraft about how to use a number of different tools to make this happen. And definitely we do not want to be involved in a war. But we need to stand up for the things we believe in, which are human rights, navigational rights, the right of countries to have the systems that they want to have, and a respect for people.
Thank you.
And Tara? There you are.
Hi, Madam Secretary. My name is Tara. I'm really glad to be able to ask this question. So how can American populists and leaders stop the politicization of facts and science? And do you think it's possible anytime soon?
Well, I think that a lot depends on Tuesday, but I do think that there needs to be a understanding that the issues that have to be dealt with do have a scientific basis, that there are such things as facts, that there is the necessity of people understanding. And then I think one of the parts, and I hope that this message kind of comes across to all of you, that decision-making requires a mixture of people with different talents, and that it's important to have scientists in the room. It's important to have people that understand the history of our country and other countries, that understand the mechanics of how governments operate, that are able to put themselves into the shoes of the country or people that we're dealing with. But I think it is very important to get the scientists in the room and respect what they're going to say, and understand that maybe we don't all understand physics or various parts of the genome phases or DNA or how diseases spread, but there are people who do, and to have some humility in terms of listening to them. It is absolutely essential. The other part that I think is important, and I do think that one of the things, and I was going to kind of mention this towards the end, that we need to have respect for the younger generations. There is hardly a book or a speech that's ever given that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So one of my favorite quotes is, "The older I get, the younger are my teachers." And I do think that your generation, the fact that I've been asked a number of questions about climate change, that I know, for instance, your understanding of technology, how to operate within this kind of a world at the moment, that we are going to need to have a very important cross-generational activities where we respect, we older people, the things that you know instinctively that you are capable of doing, and then some of you might respect some wisdom. But I do think that there needs to be an understanding that we are in a new era. I fully believe that what has happened is this is a very different era from the ones that we have just been in, that the third decade of the 21st century is going to be different, and you all are going to be the leaders that make decisions based on facts.
All right, this pains me because I have a dozen more questions and we have a dozen more student questions, but this is where we've got to cut it off. That's a perfect place to cut it off. Thank you, Madam Secretary. She doesn't need the money for this, so I'm not plugging this for her sake. I can barely see with my funny screen. This is a great biography, the Madam Secretary. I've read a lot of political biographies, and this one gets into personal aspects of what it's like to juggle career and family in a way that's absolutely fascinating. Next week, we'll have a conversation about the election, because a week from now, we'll know more. We may not know a winner, but we'll know more. For those of you who are not enrolled in UCDC but are listening to this, talk to your campus representative, come to Washington. People like Secretary Albright walk the streets, and some of them are willing to share their time with students. We really appreciate your doing this, and good luck with whatever you do next, Madam Secretary.
Well, thank you all very much. I've enjoyed this, and I really do love spending time with students. It is one of the most enriching things that I do as a professor, and whenever I can spend time with students, I do it with pleasure, and you guys have asked terrific questions. So good luck to you in what you're doing now and whatever you're going to do in the future. You are really the answer to a lot of questions. Thank you.
Thank you.